I've opened up something special. I'm offering a complimentary coaching session, and I invite you to wisesquirrels.com/coaching right now before it fills up. Welcome to Wise Squirrels, the podcast for late diagnosed adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Dave Delaney. Before I kick off the interview today, I wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items. I have announced the first in-person meetup. It'll be February 13th here in Nashville, Tennessee. You can find details about this event and upcoming events at wisesquirrels.com. I'll be doing a lot of traveling this year, both across the States and into Canada, and hopefully over to Europe. Let me know if you have a conference, company, or association you'd like me to come to deliver a presentation for. And I'm planning meetups everywhere I go. I will be announcing those on the events page at wisesquirrels.com/events. I've created a form on that page that asks you to share where you live. Not your home address, of course, just what city, state, province, country that you're in order for me to plan these events and to be sure to notify you when I will be doing an event in your city. So fill out the form and let me know where you are, and I will be sure to let you know when I am planning an event near you. Wise Squirrels could not be created without the support of our Substack members and Patreon members. I've shifted from Patreon over to Substack. I don't know if this was a mistake and that you might find it easier to use Patreon, so Patreon is still available. If you do sign up at Patreon, I will add your email as a premium member to the Substack also, and I will be doing most of that communication of bonus material, extra special events, and other items like the body scan meditation that I just posted for our premium members. If you are enjoying this podcast, would you please consider becoming a Substack member? By becoming a premium member, you're supporting what I'm doing here, and I need that support. So if you're enjoying this podcast or the articles or the Substack free version, I would sincerely appreciate it if you would chip in. It's about the cost of a fancy coffee, moderately fancy coffee, once a month. To do that, just visit wisesquirrels.com/love. You'll find the link there. It's also in the show description on your podcast app. You can just click that link now and support me. And I thank you for your support.
I am Holly White. I am a cognitive psychologist by training, and at present, I'm an independent consultant, researcher, and author, working on a new book, as well as continuing to publish articles about my research. And these days, primarily, my research is in the area of creativity and its overlap with ADHD or ADD or whatever we want to go with now for terminology. All the same beast, essentially. And I think I'm really trying to do a bit more to connect with people both outside of academia and just all over the place, because I think in the past, so much important information has become very isolated in one context or another, and people need to kind of start talking. And that's where you see all these great bits of overlap. As you said, you noticed an article I'd published in Scientific American, and that's where I received the most feedback, which is wonderful. But it surprised me in that when you're trained in academia, you're really told you've got to publish in these, in your peer-reviewed journals, and that's really the push and the impetus, and it's great. You do that, but then sometimes your things stay really isolated in that community, and the message doesn't get out there. So when I had an opportunity to discuss some of my work, and not just one of those sort of reprint blips, but actually to do a short article for Scientific American, it got out there to a broader audience. And that's when I started hearing from people. And I realized how much this whole notion of anything from ADHD in the adult population to having some kind of creative energy or edge, that really resonated with people. And I started hearing much more from the community there.
Yeah, and it's great. I mean, so you did let's talk about that study from 2019. Yeah, and you were with the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And
Yeah.
I continue to collaborate. We have a collaborative relationship. I'm not actually physically at the university anymore. I'm now in Massachusetts, but we continue to do some work. But that's where we had done that study.
That's
Yes.
great. Yeah. So let's talk about that.
That particular study was one of the latest in a series of studies that I had done. I started the publications in this area in 2005 with my dissertation work. So I had been looking for a while at creativity and creative advantages associated with ADHD in using a more theoretical perspective, really trying to kind of take a science-based approach where I was using the same sorts of tools and measures that people were using to identify classic impairments and applying those to the same types of thinking processes, but how they lend themselves to more positive things. I essentially we're talking about the same brain mechanisms, but it's a context dependent thing where in some activities you see a negative consequence from having maybe the distractibility, but in other places that can actually be an advantage. So I started early on with looking at some of these different processes. And so in the 2019 article, this was one of the later things that I had done, but I was looking at just a couple more sort of, I guess, applications of this particular ADHD mindset. So I was very interested in this case in the same things that I guess you'd say normally would shield the ADHD brain from distraction, which are obviously not in place, right? Because there is a whole lot of traffic coming in and out. And if you put that sort of brain in the context of anything that requires you to stay focused, you're going to notice those impairments, or a classroom, that sort of thing. But in the world of creativity, that distractibility can be an asset in a number of different ways. In the research that we were just speaking of, what we're talking about is when you are not, I guess, overly limited by a specific context you're supposed to pay attention to right at that moment, or, for example, the influence of prior knowledge or examples, then you're able to think outside of that. So really, I focused in that study on having, I guess, an edge about not being constrained by what has already been created or invented. So in a way, you're almost distracted from the thing that normally limits other people. So I guess kind of going back to this notion of design fixation, something they talk about quite a bit in engineering and in art, this idea that it's hard to imagine outside of what already exists. We tend to think, if someone says create a new such and such, we mentally pull up our image of what is there now, and we sort of create around that. But the ADHD brain is, even in doing that, even in creating around an example, is going to be distracted from that example and distracted from their own internal assumptions and constraints. And that actually creates a lot of freedom in the creative process. And so, other people might be sort of following the rules, so to speak, and yet that's the very thing that's going to keep you kind of constrained into a particular example or template. And I think in the article, too, I did talk about a couple different processes that are unique to the ADHD brain. And one thing that, as it turns out, it's difficult to talk about any particular creative edge in ADHD without talking about a whole lot of different things that come into it. So it's really not one of those situations where we could isolate one type of creativity to one part of, the ADHD characteristics or brain settings. It's actually a whole lot of things. So even with the distractibility, but I will say that if you were to take a lot of different, say, creative tendencies or things that come up in the creative mind or process, and you had that within a space, then you have, on the other hand, all of those different traits and characteristics that make up a person's mind who has ADHD. those two spaces or circles would overlap, and in the middle would be that creative generation space. So it's not that everything about ADHD is going to lend itself to being creative. Like I would say my tendency to stub my toe maybe more often than other people around me. That's just not, there's no way I can make that into a good thing.
Right.
But there's other things, that, and then there's going to be certain creative processes or processes that help you to be more creative. Things like taking an idea and really thinking it through completely, elaborating on it or clarifying it. Some of those things may be more challenging for a person with ADHD, or even say implementing or launching something might be more challenging, because it tends to be the case that many people with ADHD want to spend their time brainstorming and generating ideas. And then it's like, that's the fun part. And once that's done, it's okay for someone else to take that idea and run with it.
Yeah.
While they go back to coming up with more ideas, which is fine. I think a lot of different types of minds are required to collectively come up with creative processes and ideas. But it just seems that by virtue of the way the ADHD mind is put together, there are some areas within the creative space that just absolutely, resonate together. They're just the same things that cause some of the impairments in some contexts are an edge in those things that, for example, require us to think outside of, well, I don't want to say the box, that's so overused, but it's true, really, to think outside of what already exists, to think outside of what we know, to not let those things constrain us, to not really be very limited in our thinking. And so you could imagine it really is very similar to the idea of the inverse of the process you need to sit still and pay attention in school, which is, of course, where this whole notion of ADHD as a limitation comes up. And I think a lot of times, and maybe people in your audience too will recognize this tendency of maybe finding themselves diagnosed or self-diagnosing after their child or someone they know is diagnosed, later in life. Like, oh, looking back, I guess that's what was going on, And many times that happens too, because the person as an adult they might think, well, looking back, things might have been a little bit easier and I would have appreciated X, Y, Z had I known. But then again, I kind of found ways to work with it. And sometimes that kind of creative spirit, and that if you have the right, opportunities and things mixed in, you're going to have a tendency to pursue something that is a good fit and really calls to where your gifts are. So I think in that sense, some people may not have known they had something that's a disorder, because in a lot of ways it didn't limit them or impair them,
right?
In that many ways, because again, it depends on the context. And even with respect to attention, if I really say what I think that, attention is attentional difference more than anything, I think a lot of people who study ADHD will say it's more of a difference than a deficit. There's attention. It may or may not be directed where others want it to be, or even where we want it to be at any given time, but it's there. It's just a very unruly attention. So if you are in a context that allows you to, say, shift gears and do a lot of different things, or have new opportunities, or explore, or create different things, all of those situations really work well for the ADHD mind. And so I think there's going to be times where if you're in the right field, there's many people who will say, this is a great fit. This is the best. If I didn't have my mind wired the way it was, I maybe wouldn't be able to do this as well as I do. And that said, I know that may sound somewhat overly optimistic, and I would say you don't get to choose which side of the coin you have there all the time. You have these advantages. At the same time, you can, people might find that they're their own worst enemy, or that they procrastinate, or they do this, that, or the other thing that makes it very difficult to actually create or do whatever it is that their ADHD brain wants to do. So that's where I say, well, it's fine. I mean, you can certainly recognize those challenges, but it doesn't negate the fact that there are very real, synergies between the ADHD mind and the creative mind. It's just a question of recognizing which processes you then need to kind of hone, or which strategies you can use to make up for shortcomings, and then also pairing together different types of minds. I think as a society, or as a social species, I think humans really are meant to be interconnected and interdependent. And it isn't necessarily for any one person to be able to be really good at everything.
Yeah.
Certainly we wouldn't expect that.
Right.
And so once you recognize where each person's strengths and weaknesses are, then they can kind of be used to complement one another, or just find out what, so if a person say, I'm an idea generator, but I can't ever follow through, rather than just feeling frustrated by that, finding a person who has a lot of energy and really likes to implement things or make a difference, or maybe, do some action, and might feel like, well, I don't really have any fresh ideas, but I can recognize one when I see it, and I can do something with it.
You touched on something there. There are a couple of different points that you've made that really stood out to me. One of them is the need to find the others, to collaborate, to find community. I work by myself for the most part, and I do my best work when I'm with other people, whether it's standing on stages or delivering workshops or coaching. But when I'm home alone, just the dog and I, oftentimes that's when I'm at my worst. I'm at my best when I'm interacting with other people. And so sometimes I think, like with entrepreneurs, for example, you almost have to, if you're a neurotypical or a neurodiverse entrepreneur, you almost have to find like a neurotypical business partner, or you know what I mean? There should be some sort of like speed dating or something to find the others, because I think that's a big part of it. And it also applies to this loneliness epidemic that is very real and that is affecting our societies and our health and so on. So what are your thoughts about finding the others? How can we find the others?
Well, first of all, just saying that, I think you've given us a great example of, you just threw it right out there, but off the cuff kind of, that's brilliant. Like, whoa, what if we had kind of like some kind of brain matching type of app where you could find like-minded or complementary minded people to join in on a project. Those things, we have those different tools out there in psychology that can kind of get an idea of where people's strengths are and their preferences and that sort of thing. And they're usually talked about in the context of HR, human resources and business applications. But it really is true that maybe even post-COVID and everything, I think there's so many of us, you and myself as well, who are kind of working in our own bubble. We don't want it to be about, but we're maybe physically in our own home and are not necessarily going out to a big hub full of activity all the time where there's all these other people. So how can you keep that energy and that momentum going? And I think for someone with ADHD, there's so much variability that's built in to just about everything associated with ADHD. So whether it's, you kind of throw that hyperactive component in there, but I know, for myself, sometimes I'm very energetic, especially when I'm talking to other people about something I'm interested in. And other times I'm just blah, and I can't push myself, or I have no motivation, depending on what it is I don't want to do. Yeah. And so there's a lot of, sometimes to keep the energy and momentum up, especially self-motivation, and to do those components of the everyday work or even the work you love that are going to be required to facilitate the goal, but they're not necessarily the strong points. Just to keep up that momentum and energy, I think requires those interpersonal connections and all these other people. And I think it's so important for us to remember that we are not intended to be isolated, and to maybe use these tools like this opportunity to do, the podcasts and the different communication opportunities, and going out there to just remember that we have all these opportunities to connect with one another that are out there. And as I think I've found that I've kind of struck up conversations with more diverse voices and people all over the place through things like podcasts and invites and the internet, and so there's that. But I do think sometimes people who have these sort of outside the box thinking styles will gravitate toward one another. And then we'll get into this big idea storm where we'll have so many ideas and not be sure where to start. And I think I have found that for myself, when in the past I worked with a lot of different students and mentored research projects, some of the best, most rewarding collaborations that I would have is between myself and a more linear thinker, or a group of us that had people who were kind of at different places with that level of, organization. And so I think, just as I said, that the distractibility opens us up to ideas. If you took the other extreme and had somebody that could really see just a straight line and what's exactly in front of them, they would be able to do things in a way that's very careful, very objectively focused, one goal at a time. And so I think it's so important to recognize the value of that, and recognize the value of the sort of opposite of that and other things in between, rather than getting caught up in sort of this, I guess, narrative of which one is better.
Yeah.
And I want to always avoid that, because I think in the past it's, there's been a lot of negativity about ADHD, and, this is not the way we want to think. But then it became a whole conversation about fixing it. And I don't think it's right to think of something as broken, but rather just different. Because if you focus on the differences, there is that opportunity for complementary strengths to say, no, a person who's very much thinking in a specific linear way, rather than criticize them as being unimaginative, think of them as potentially having the tools to make it happen.
Yeah. I almost imagine sorry to interrupt. I almost imagine like a dating app, right? Where like you can swipe the people based on their neurotypes, but also based on their creative interests, their business interests, their professional aspirations, from an entrepreneurial sort of point of view or an artistic point of view, and which the two go hand in hand anyway. And then you could drill down by like geography to say, okay, hey, I'm in Nashville and you're in Nashville. Let's go get a coffee and see what we can dream up. I think
awesome. So we've got like a hybrid between Indeed, Tinder, ResearchGate, and a classic Facebook. I love it.
Right.
Do you know, if we were to just move past a lot, you've got just one of those things where I think if you have a very individualistic society, and, culturally, United States is one that is a bit more individualistic, and we tend to want to succeed and have that feeling of that personal success and independence, and that notion that we should be able to be good at most things and be self-sufficient. And those are all important things, but to a limit, because of course we're not lone wolves. We're humans are very social. They're meant to have a sort of diversified strengths and that are complementary. So if we were to, say, capitalize on this amazing digital technology that we have now and connect with one another. So rather than the internet becoming a space where you see these clusters of people who are all thinking the same, you don't want to, promote a group think, but instead you say, I want to sort of cross-pollinate ideas with other people, and I can recognize that. I don't know how you feel about this, but for myself, I feel sometimes like I have ideas now and again that maybe could end up being those silly as seen on TV products or something. If only I had the energy to bother making them.
Right.
Or so, but it's like, wouldn't it be fun to have something like you were saying, like this app, and you go and say, well, what are your interests? I mean, I love dogs. I love anything related to animal welfare. I love then I'm interested in climate change stuff or whatever. So those things, and then say, and maybe take a little quiz or something to talk about the preferences or strengths. And imagine having something, or even like a meetup type thing, where then you get together and go somewhere and do a project. Yeah. And at least in theory, the synergy would be amazing.
Yeah. And I'm actually, And you've sort of, you're reminding me of my interest that I've shared sort of not on the show, but I've shared offline with some friends and colleagues, how I would love to create a Wise Squirrels event to have people come out and have some guest speakers who are ADHD experts, but then also, have the audience as Wise Squirrels, mid-career people that are recently diagnosed and trying to get a handle of that, but finding their community and then, sharing their networks too. I wrote a book years ago called New Business Networking. And so I'm all about the power of people, the power of coming together, and the power of using both in person and online to build relationships and meet new people. So yeah, maybe we need to design this app and get it out in the world so people can start connecting. But I love that. Now you talked also about the fact that wise squirrels, ADHDers tend to be more creative because of their distractibility from ideas that might knock them off course from that creative endeavor. If I'm sort of paraphrasing what you said there, and if I'm on the right path with that and what you mentioned, well, first of all, am I on the right path? And then secondly, when self-doubt and imposter syndrome kick in, which unfortunately seems to be rampant among ADHDers, as well as any high achiever, really. But tell me a little bit about that, like how we can navigate when that self-doubt kicks in and starts to scare us from doing the thing or finishing the project.
All right. Well, I would say firstly, yeah, absolutely. You're on the right path as far as that is one of these gifts, this idea that when you don't have these constraints stopping your creativity, the sky's the limit. But and by the same token, I think there are times when, the old adage that necessity is the mother of invention. I think sometimes if you're forced to sort of figure things out as you go or invent new ways of doing things because the standard way just doesn't work for you, then sometimes just by virtue of adapting to your environment, you can become creative, come up with different ways to do things. But I think if your default style of doing things is very original, and let me just jump for a second before we talk about that and imposter syndrome to say creativity, because there is sometimes some misunderstanding about the idea of that word. I'm kind of thinking in terms of anything that is innovative and potentially valuable. So it could be in any of the traditional sorts of fine arts or visual arts or culinary arts, performing arts, but also improv or music. But then there's also innovative approaches to doing things, or actually the creativity that I would just say is happening in the discussion of this, creating an app or an innovation in terms of how we view idea space or pulling people together. So anytime you have an approach that's very different or very new, and there's a lot of different characteristics of ADHD in addition to the distractibility that contribute to that very original thinking. But I think that the original thinking can make people feel a bit isolated. And then there's also times where if a person with ADHD is kind of growing up and coming through the world being told enough that the way they think really kind of needs to be fixed, that adds another layer onto the traditional sort of imposter syndrome that I think we all get, especially as we start to gain success or something really cool happens, like we see this great logo for our company or our business cards come out or whatever it is, that all of a sudden we feel like a little kid or maybe I don't know, am I good enough or am I this or am I that? And I think too that's of course, like you said, that's going to happen for a lot of people. And especially if a person values doing well, then they're going to always wonder, am I doing well? But I think sometimes there's, in addition to maybe an imposter syndrome, is almost this feeling of, at times, maybe like a stranger, an alien type of feeling. And I don't know if I'm just speaking from my own experience, but there would be times where I say something and it's like, am I the only one thinking this? Maybe, what's wrong with me? Okay. Or other people look at me like, where did that come from? Okay, I don't know. But yet if I'm with other people who sort of think like I do, they're like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
In another, it's so funny because I think, okay, so there's this thing too, that when it comes to things that are highly creative or innovative or different, by definition, they're going to be rare. I mean, you say that if something is new and it has to have that novelty, that's a component of the creative definition, then it means that it isn't out there yet, at least not in that form. And the more creative it is, the less it's already out there.
Right.
And so you get into other psychological variables like people's comfort zones. I mean, people are saying they want innovation, but they don't want too much innovation, depending on their comfort zone. It's like, well, yeah, I want something different. And then you go and you're like, here, how's this? And it's like, whoa, I didn't really mean that different. I meant just tweak this. So I think sometimes teaching people that it's safe to move outside that comfort zone, and that if you're a person who thinks like that anyway, you think, I'm comfortable with my wild, crazy ideas, but then you go to broach them with others and you get a mixed reaction along with this feeling of, am I the person to talk about this? Do I even know what I'm talking about? So I think sometimes we tend to doubt ourselves, but I think maybe as far as a solution to that, I try to remind myself is just, no, this is how I think, and I've got to go with it because, that if I doubt the process, that's usually when I mangle it. If I look back at the things I've done, like I'll have this idea and I'll think this is my intuition and I really just know. I'm not maybe sure how it'll turn out, but I want it, and I actually want it for the outcome and what it can do. It's not about the ego. So in the beginning, I have that enthusiasm and I'm not worrying about how I might come across, and I'll go with it. But then once that idea is received, or at least in its beginning forms, it's received, depending on how it's received. If I get any sort of negative feedback, I sometimes get, I think, pulled back a little too much. Like, oh, okay. And then I kind of withdraw and go back into, okay, maybe that was a little too much, versus thinking, maybe I need to be the ambassador in the new space. Maybe they weren't ready for something. I just threw something at them they'd never heard of before. So rather than being put off by their reluctance, let me see that they're going to experience some discomfort because it's a new idea. So if I'm coming from, the right space, and I think, well, okay, I might not be ready to continue talking to them about this, or I can't persuade them, but I could at least hold on to my own conviction by saying, well, let me stay with my own voice. Let me be true to my voice. I think because people that think differently have a different perspective and a different voice, they're very often going to come up against things that maybe look cleaner and more organized and well put together, and they may think, well, is it supposed to look like that?
Right.
And so I think we might doubt the very things that are the source of genius. So I think
it's almost like
for us to, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, it's almost like we just need to keep pushing forward on ideas, that I think I often use I do a lot of public speaking and I, talk about innovation and things and some of the content that I have. And I often talk about like Steve Jobs, who's like,
Yes.
a great example of someone who, but he's an example, like he did not invent the MP3 player, nor did he invent a mobile phone right. So like he was the one that he took existing ideas and made them better and made them incredible. But it's also really important, getting back to that point about finding the others, is that he also didn't do this stuff alone. Right.
Right. And so he was one that was maybe coming from, he could appreciate that as you could see from the Apple motto, the think different. He would embrace that way of thinking. So even if he wasn't generating himself, he could recognize the utility. So I think for us, finding our advocates too. So finding people that can look at something and say, okay, I don't quite understand it and it's really out there.
Right.
But I'm going to trust you on this. Let's go for it. I'm going to try to back you and give you some of the guidance and structure that you need to make this happen.
Right.
And so, because there's other times, or if you look back in history, that you'll see that so-and-so maybe proposed this idea and he was totally shot down and thrown out as a this wild renegade idea. And then later you think, ooh, that was your loss because this person came up with this or this person came up with that. And then, even when I say undoing little things. So just as there's some people very good about continuing to adapt ideas, and I think those things are important too, because a person who is very innovative, if they're not constrained by existing ideas, well, let's say they're not constrained, say, by anybody. If you are a designer and maybe you want to build a bridge and you have this fantastical idea and you bring it to the architects, and then some of the engineers are thinking, a bridge can't, what? It's going to collapse. What are you thinking? So, but if you have the right people in the right space, you can think, there's not a superior way to think. And I think we can all accept that, right? So if we all agree on that there isn't one best way to think, and if we are coming at this not because we want to feed our egos or get rich, but because we genuinely believe in an idea, then maybe this is overly optimistic, but I think that it's hard to go wrong with that combination in the sense of at least not being thwarted by other people's opinions or by, maybe this just wasn't meant to happen. Brilliant ideas are not always recognized in their time, but it's also because sometimes people aren't ready. But the more you have, I think, a network, sort of a supportive network, the more you have, it makes me think almost of a family, but like a fairly functional or at least loving family where you can have some distress in some aspects of that family, and some of the other family members will kind of step in and give support and nourish and have your back. And I think that feeling of that, and even maybe we don't always have that on a professional level, maybe that's important too, to say, if we were to have our app to say, I have this new idea I was kind of playing with, and I'm almost not sure about it, and I'm feeling like I'm questioning myself. Let me throw it out there to my network. And even hearing from people that have a very high tolerance for wild, crazy ideas is going to feel good. It's going to say something like, if the only reason you were really doubting yourself is because of a regular amount of self-doubt that we all feel, or just because the idea is very different, at least we have that support and we can realize, all right, so maybe some of the pushback I'm getting is because people aren't maybe quite accustomed to something this different, but not because it's a bad idea and not because I can't execute the idea. And as the architect of the idea, you certainly have a place in it, as long as you could also feel like there's a time to step back or invite somebody else into that space, or maybe allow other people to help you implement that, knowing that maybe each person's not going to be recognizing all of the different constraints in the field. Right? So I guess, so someone else might be able to, but still stay true to the original idea by listening to your gut.
Yeah. And so much of it is about, a lot of what I'm hearing today is a great reminder of getting out of your comfort zones and meeting people in your community who may be able to compliment you, not like compliment you in a sort of bringing something to fruition, synergistic kind of way. Yeah, exactly. Because I've actually
yin and yang, right?
Right, exactly. Because I've been on this kick lately where I've been writing about how I wrote a blog post recently on Wise Squirrels about, and I've been trying to get feedback from the community, and I haven't got a lot yet, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. So I have this hypothesis, this theory that there is this phrase we hear a lot, which is ADHD is a superpower, or ADHD is awesome, or whatever you want to, but superpower is the one you tend to hear quite a lot. My theory is this. I was listening to, and this came into my head when I was listening. I heard a Paris Hilton song, a pretty new song about her ADHD. And it's basically like the chorus is something to the effect of my superpower is my ADHD or something to that effect. And with all due respect to Paris Hilton, I feel that, and I'm not really a Paris Hilton fan. I'm not even really a pop music fan, but I digress. My theory is that the more privilege you have, the more likely you will say your ADHD is a superpower. The more money you have, the more freedom you have, the more social status you have, the more you can say, oh yeah, ADHD is a superpower because I don't have bills to pay because I've got millions of dollars and I don't have, I've got lots of social friends and things. So I don't need to worry about that, so that I can just go out in the world and do my best work and not have to worry. Then hell yeah, it's a superpower. But to me, I'm like, I still have bills to pay. I've got 2 kids going to college and I need to figure out how to help pay for their tuitions. And so to me, it's like where I identify the wonderful attributes of Wise Squirrels, there's still challenges. It's not to say that this isn't a challenge, right? And
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts, first of all, on that? Yeah.
Well, I would say in the case of someone who is lucky enough to perhaps have, be an heiress, then there's a little bit of a confound. You can't really, it's hard to know if a person's not maybe self-made, and I shouldn't say that because I don't know what aspects this person has that she is doing on her own. So if you're talking about someone who claims this is my superpower and here's how this has it in the sense that this is my goal and I wanted to do this, and whatever it is that I'm endeavoring to do, my ADHD is what absolutely powers it. And as you said, I think when you're talking about something like a person who has all these other resources, to some extent, they have a lot of things that are taking care of those everyday things that are so difficult for a person in the real world with ADHD. So I think they have the maybe the luxury of focusing on the superpower part because they can't make too much of a mess using the rest of their not so superpowers if somebody else is there to compensate for them.
Right.
Or if they have enough money and such on. With the ADHD is awesome makes me think of, like Penn Holderness's book. The title is The ADHD is Awesome. And I love watching his the different things that he has created with his wife, and I think, wow, his wife is so wonderful, and all ADD people should have one of her in their life. A person who, so I'm thinking, and the big joke is, he'll show. She'll put a Post-it note on his forehead or something with a reminder, and he's free to be as ADD as he wants to be. And right. I don't mean that, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but the idea is if you have a life partner who, your pluses and minuses come together in a way that it's just more than it could ever be, then you don't feel the negative part. So I think to the extent that we can create our support networks, then we can recognize the good part. But, when you even say, too, that the superpower thing is anything that's real world, I think is going to have pluses and minuses. And I think where we get into the language of talking about it, framing something in that positive language, to some extent, I think that it's people's attempt to really compensate for a lot of negativity that's out there. But they do so at the risk of maybe, I think it might almost be offensive to some extent to people who really are a little bit more constrained by the negative aspects. And so I think in a way you could think of, ADHD is ADHD. And so it can be, in some contexts, it can be an asset. But in a certain fields, you might excel even more so if you had ADHD than if you didn't, all else being equal. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where I really am interested, because there are some very real things where, because life is complex and tasks are complex and the brain is complex, you're rarely, if ever, going to have a situation where there's a perfectly built brain for one particular task, and that's that. It's much more complicated. So there's trade-offs, and so I would say that to the extent that even, if you look in the book, ADHD is Awesome, how much Penn will say, well, there's certainly a lot of caveats with that, and, most of the time or sometimes, and it becomes more of okay, throughout my life, this has been a huge challenge, but I've come to appreciate that it's also what might be behind the things I really value about myself. So I think when you get to the full message there, if we don't shortchange it, I think that it doesn't have to become, we could say there are people talking about it using some of the catchphrases, but if we can see that there's more than that, that's important for the discussion. I think of when people would talk about different trends in body image or weight loss, that sometimes to sort of combat a lot of the negativity surrounding obesity, the message became big is beautiful. And I think the idea would just be, don't be too hard on yourself, embrace yourself. But at the same time, obesity is unhealthy, and you don't want people to overly embrace that because it's not, there's a middle ground there, right? So I think sometimes you hear people creating a message because their intent is to offset the stigma, and you think if enough people say it's good, then maybe people won't think it's bad. But I think we always run the risk of oversimplifying something and maybe doing it a bit of an injustice, because there can be a boomerang effect there too. We're not, we all know very well that, my gosh, I don't know if it's just me but my hypothesis is people with ADHD, like myself, have a lot of bruises. I swear I walk into things all the time. My head is wherever it is. And I may or may not walk into a signpost or trip over root. But and I'm not going to say that's a good thing. I'm lucky that, I haven't fallen off a cliff. But, it is what it is. So it's and that's obviously not, I say that kind of fun. But there's other things. Like, for example, I have more data and more research than I know what to do. I could fill volumes and I want that to be out there if I could snap my fingers and make it happen. But I struggle with my own pulling in a million directions or taking on so many things. And I think with the ADHD mind, sometimes we're like a computer that has so many open windows that it freezes. It's like, okay, I've decided to open 100 applications and now I can't think.
Right.
And I think our brains do that. And all of a sudden, it's hard because it's like, on one hand, we know we have something to offer and something to say. But if we open our mouths and it comes out all jumbled and garbled and we get lost, it's really easy to think, what the hell was I thinking?
Yeah.
Sorry, I guess you can bleep that. I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
And then we could go hide again in our isolation. I think that maybe it's so important for people to find that middle ground. So, for example, I think we had this shift toward people making accommodations, say in school context and such, making accommodations for people with ADHD and giving additional time and all of these things that were also very controversial. And I like to think of, rather than trying to say, in a way, I think maybe it's important to consider changing the entire approach and system and not just making changes for one person, which implies there's one best way to think. And if you don't think that way, let's change around you, but still sort of, instead of just saying, gosh, the brain is amazingly unique. And even if 80% of the people tend to think one way, and so it's easier to say, shape a curriculum around that way of thinking. And then if you don't think that way, we'll make special exceptions so you can do your own thing. But still the implication is that's not really a good way to do it. And instead just say, what I'd say to kids is, nobody looks at your elementary school transcript, right?
Right.
They don't even look at your high school transcript if you go on to college. So it's, if you get a C, you get a C. C's not even failing. Just that whole sort of teaching kids that, first of all, let's have some balance. Let's chill. It's okay. It's so much better to be able to think for yourself than to be able to memorize facts and spit them out in a straight line. But also, if we teach kids not only to, think for themselves and learn concepts, but to learn about how they learn and learn about how other people learn.
Yeah.
And have them start to learn to act as though they will in the real world, in groups and in activities and in self-inspired endeavors. And so much is changing so fast that I'm finding a lot of tools in the digital age are really starting to even the playing field too, in such a way that when we can use people who don't have that imaginative type of mindset can use certain tools to help inspire imagination. And people that have very scattered minds can use some of these tools to kind of streamline their thoughts.
I've had success using like AI, like ChatGPT and things. But I'm also savvy enough to know that, and I believe the line is, whoever invented the shipwreck. And with AI,
Absolutely.
obviously with not a lot of time left to talk about it, obviously that is a big can of worms for, what the future looks like, and talking about, these ideas and creativity of, like Austin, do you know Austin Kleon? He's got a book called, Steal Like an Artist.
No.
Okay.
I have to check that out.
It's a great book, but and his idea is that basically like everything is stolen, and not advocating for stealing things verbatim, but or specifically, but what I'm saying is that, rock and roll wouldn't be rock and roll without blues. Right. So like things change and pivot
Absolutely.
and evolve,
Yes.
and we take what exists already. And when I've done a fair amount of work in technology companies. And so often now with startups, you always phrase things like, well, Airbnb, it's like an Uber. Well, it's like the Airbnb of X or the Uber of Y, so that people understand what it is. Right.
Yes.
And so it's taking existing ideas and then making them better or improving upon them, like Steve Jobs. Of course, we are in a time now where we have no idea. We can't even fathom what is coming in the future from AI, which I think is exciting and horrific.
Right. I have kind of my hybrid science and science fiction ideas on that, but I'm working on a couple different, I guess you'd call them sort of speculative type fiction books on this. But
oh wow,
it's a whole new frontier and a lot of levels. So I think that one thing that, without getting into a whole discussion that could be agreed on, is that we have, maybe every generation says this, I don't know, but it feels like there have been so many advances, so many changes in human living and structure in society with in our lifetime, the internet even,
sure.
These kids now that have never known a time before it when you had to go to books and the library to do a paper. So everything is changing very, very quickly and almost exponentially. And so if one of the basics that we know from human evolution is that when the environment changes, that's when differences become potentially advantageous or deleterious. It could be either way. And so if you can adapt, if you can change, if you can move with the times and be flexible, you're in a power position. And one of the good things about being able to think differently or be flexible about that is that you can adapt with these different ways of thinking. But I think probably in the interest of time, even to go back to this idea of, so what are we talking about? I think that ADHD and non-ADHD brains are going to certainly be more alike than different, in the sense that we have our human brain and we have a lot of our basic processes. And even with creativity, they'll say there's nothing new on earth. To some extent, we don't create in a vacuum. And as you said, each thing is going to be an extension or hybridization of other things that have come before it. And so when we talk about differences, we're just talking about relative differences of how much one person could take, item X and make it incrementally slightly different versus much, much, much different. And yet comparing those to one another, there's still different versions of the same inspiring source. It's just a little bit of a difference there in terms of how you're thinking. So I would say that it wouldn't be the case to say that ADHD is either going to be the saviors of the world or the way to think, or is even necessarily, if it is a superpower, it's going to be in context. And it's superpower sometimes, depending on what you're doing. And it can be the exact opposite in other times.
Right.
And I think it's just important to certainly to recognize that, so as not to say to somebody, it's great, and to really undermine their experience when they're struggling. When you first mentioned it, it made me think of children, a person, say, that has 4 or 5 kids, who then has, let's say they also have a supportive extended family and lots of resources, and they're very well off. And they say, the children are the joy of my life. I can't imagine anything more wonderful. And now imagine a single mother who's in poverty and has the same thing. And she loves her children too, but my God, her it's not a wonderful, fabulous thing.
Yeah.
It's hard work and it's difficult. So I would say, well, which one's right? And they could see it's all about, you have elements that change their look depending on their context, but in a way that's understandable and meaningful, so that we could say, well, maybe there are joyful things about children. I mean, certainly they're not, just terrible, terrible things that happen to people, but they're certainly difficult.
Yeah.
And there's some things that make them more difficult. But as we recognize some of those same things that create advantages, even if we don't have the ability to say, well, we don't have any disadvantages with ADHD, and you say, yes, if you have ADHD, you do. So let's not pretend you don't. They affect people to different extents. And it's not even, sometimes it's a question of what else you have going on in your mind, and not just maybe what you have for resources. But if you also have, say, a learning disability, or a developmental impairment, or extreme anxiety, or just many of the things that can also come along with, you may have a very different presentation of this. So I think it's important not to take one section and say, this is representative of the entire experience. But likewise, I don't think it would be fair to do the other extreme and say anybody who has these characteristics is doomed because of XYZ, but just to find some middle ground, and maybe for us not to, or if we do use the terms so again, I keep thinking of the big is beautiful, or good to be this, or good to be that. Sometimes those are part of a counterculture, and they're just to sort of offset that. If we see them for then think, okay, that's obviously an oversimplification. We don't want that to be too much of the take-home message.
Right.
And so when people say, let's bring neurodiversity into the workforce, and I recently talked to Deloitte about this, and I'm thinking, you sure you want to do that? Before, you just know what you're asking for and be ready. And I mean that in the sense that don't just expect to bring in superpowers, but bring in minds that think a certain way and be prepared to make it work for everybody. You've got to have a climate of innovation. You have to have an environment that supports all these different things. Give people an opportunity to express what they need, what they can give, where they can interconnect, and they can thrive. You don't just sort of bring in, little units of neurodiversity and they're going to spark innovation. It just, people are more complex than that. And I think all of it is more complex. But I think my message with it just is that there's more to ADHD than just, say, a disorder. It can be disordering, but it isn't necessarily I don't see it as a disease in the same way. I wouldn't say that I see anything good about maybe having a condition like diabetes or cancer. I mean, there might be some lifestyle things that you do to compensate that make it better, but by itself, I don't see positive things about that. And yet with something like ADHD, though there are impairments, there really are some actual advantages in terms of the way that simply don't exist in the non-ADHD mind.
What are some of those advantages?
There's so much, but I would say just about any of the main core symptoms or characteristics of ADHD have a counterpart. So, I mean, let's just say in inhibitory control, or like the mental breaks, the things that keep us focused. I say us, let me just say the things that are intended to keep the mind focused on one topic at a time and keep out interfering information. That's inhibitory control. It's like the brake fluid, and it keeps our brain, organized. It keeps it on track. And it is necessary when the objectives stay on track. But if you would like to diverge from the path and come up with something different, by definition, you got to loosen up the brakes so you can move off the path and think differently. Well, ADHD people, we don't have any brake fluid, so we're always going off the path. So when that's a good thing, it's a good thing. When it's a bad thing, it's a bad thing. And, I would say that that's going to be the case for a lot of different things. So one thing, for example, is this idea that people can sometimes hyper-focus. And I had colleagues that would study the hyperfocus and had really done quite a bit of the seminal work in that area. And as one who's experienced plenty of not so helpful hyperfocus, they were really so optimistic about it. And they were not ADHD people. And I thought, okay, guys, just so you know, there's also the chance of burning the house down. There's also the chance. Like, so what I'm saying is, I'm like, I know you guys say, okay, you can just hyper focus on something. But just knowing, okay, there are costs. Like, for example, sometimes I'm so into something, and then if I'm interrupted, I just lose my train of thought. And I might get irritated, or, and I have to kind of catch myself with that. Or I'm so into one thing that I neglect other things.
Right.
Or I can't pull myself off of an activity. So there's any number of costs that go along with that. But yes, I guess I can acknowledge that sometimes you get that gem of time when you're just in the zone. And I mean, this conversation as an example, I mean, compared to the hour before this, I'm much more engaged and at my height right now.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And fortunately, my dog is asleep in her bed, because I can tell you if she were not, she would be saying, yeah, that's great. You've been ignoring me for an hour. So it's a good thing she hasn't been at the door trying to go outside, because she'd probably have wet the carpet.
Yeah.
But, again, it's like, if we can find tools to say, all right, working with it, recognizing what it is and what it isn't is good. So if I say I could really get into my zone for such and such, and I find that tools like alarms and things like that are good. I've got a little cube that I got on Amazon. You can flip it over to different numbers, and then that gives you that amount of time before the little alarm rings. Flip the cube, and it does it. And I'm always flipping it, like, oh, give me another, like, snooze for 10, or I flip to 60. And then I think, let me just go wild on this one thing for this amount of time. Maybe it'll be playing with graphics design. That's one of the things that really I can get very absorbed in, or my writing. And then it's like, I have to shift gears, or I won't get other things done that I need to get done. So sometimes I need the external alarm. Again, that's an ADHD feature where but while we could become very distracted, sometimes you get locked in to a very narrow focus. So I tend to think of the issue with ADHD with respect to focus as being a problem with that function that controls the lens of attention. So it's not the attention per se, it's the thing that either narrows it or expands it. Like, sometimes we're too expanded, too distracted. Sometimes we're so laser focused. And I would say that in both of those states, there are both good things and bad things. That laser focused, you are putting all that attention in, and you can come up with such good stuff during that time, but at the expense of anything else going around you, So I've learned to say, I don't cook when I'm writing. I can't. I'll sometimes put something on the stove, like boil water, and then I go and do something on my computer, intending to put pasta in. And next thing you know, I smell smoke. And I realize I've been so into what I'm doing that the water's boiled away and I'm going to burn the house down. But those are things where, with life experience, you realize this is just how my mind works. All right, I'm not going to beat myself up over it. And also, what are my priorities? Do I care about exactly when I'm cooking, or, if that, I don't care about that. I'm going to do my work, and I realize that I might have to take time out just to focus on that one other thing, or I can work my life around it. I can make changes.
That's a great point.
Support the way I think.
Well, that's a really good point too, because, I see myself with my hyper focus on ADHD. My ADHD coach said, like, more than I do at this point, Dave. Like, right. Because for the last year, I've been hyper focused on this since my diagnosis with the podcast, speaking to experts and smart people like yourself, and and reading books and learning so much. And in therapy myself, I've learned so much about ADHD. I don't claim to be a doctor, nor do I play one on the internet, but, so I'm still learning, but at the same time, I've learned so much about it. And my challenge is always, okay, so I've got this great podcast. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I'm sharing a lot of stuff, and I'm hearing wonderful feedback. And I've got some people on Patreon who are supporting the show, but like, I also have other bills to pay. And so, like, how do I shift my focus away from Wise Squirrels, or how do I shift my focus into like the business side of Wise Squirrels? Like, do I do a conference or an event or a retreat, or do I do like, I'm 18,000 words into my next book on the topic, and yet my wheels keep spinning because I talk myself out of it, because what I'm doing here is not a business right now. This is a hobby.
Right.
And
Right.
it's taking up so much of my time away from the business. And because I work for myself, and the universe keeps pushing me towards Wise Squirrels because I really feel like this is important work.
Then if you can afford it, do it for now and then see where it goes. Because I'm in a very similar boat where the things that I spend my heart and soul on right now are actually not paying the bills. The bill pay stuff I kind of do separately to pay the bills while I'm nurturing the things that I want to go somewhere. But I know that I'm starting to head towards something that will be something. And it hasn't quite taken shape yet. So I think there are times where maybe we just have to remind ourselves to have faith in that, and then to hear back from people. And the very people who are probably getting a lot from what you're doing, you might not even hear from, because there are times where people sometimes like, I meant to say something about that. I definitely was thinking it in my head, and I meant to get back to you.
Yeah.
But then I think this is the kind of resource that could be a platform to pull together all these different things. And there's times where I wonder if maybe sometimes people who are innovative and have new ideas, if we need patrons like artists, like, maybe like the starving wise squirrels, or the people who we have all these ideas, but it's hard sometimes to do both the implementation of the next step and the ideation, because some of those processes do oppose one another. So the very things that create this brilliance and this energy in the program are also going to detract maybe from the time you could take to monetize it or to do the next step.
Yeah.
So I think too, I could recognize from just taking a look at this and seeing your panelists and the discussion, the conversation, that this is such a great potential resource in whatever direction it takes next. And I think sometimes if we could give ourselves a little bit of time and not be too critical of ourselves, and to say, let's do what we do so well, which is to question our own assumptions about what we're supposed to be doing, or to not say, like, if this is something that isn't, make money yet, should I really be spending this much time on it? And then I've tried to do for myself, even say something about rotating blocks. This has been something that's really saved me, I think, from being resentful. I end up resenting. If I have to spend too much time on one thing, I'll resent it because it's taking me away from the other thing I really want to do. And instead going, let me just do rotating blocks where I say, use my little cube timer and say, I am devoting this much time. And then sometimes if I say, I'm going to just take this 30 minutes or so to think about this other thing, and then I actually devote that time to that thing that I've been maybe procrastinating on, because it could just be that we have time and we're not putting the energy there because it's not sort of our default setting. At least for myself, if I say, what's a straightforward way to apply this and take this to the next step, and it requires details and those different things that are not my calling, and maybe don't pull out my creative energy, I get a little bit stumped.
Yeah.
So that's where I think if we loop people in, once the conversation's established and you loop in people who can see it for its potential, but can add their own skill set, that it becomes something where other people can kind of pull it along and add that sort of, that give it some more direction and that kind of thing. But I think it has to get kind of established and caught on. So I try to think of something like this as the front end investment of something that is going to support other things that will come out of this.
Yeah. Well,
but I mean, like, let's keep in touch. Let this be the first step here toward pulling this together, maybe inspiring other people to use either this or the To Becoming app. I don't know. Something to identify their synergy, their network, and how can we get things done? I imagine there's a lot of people who have amazing skill sets who might be in jobs. In fact, I know I recognize them. Sometimes I'll see people who are maybe in a customer service or some position where maybe they're just so good at what they're doing. And yet I get this sense that I would love for them to be, production counterpart or something, because they've just got it all together.
Right. Yeah. I feel that way.
You know what I mean? I mean, there was somebody, and I don't want to downplay as a job, but they were I know maybe it was temporary or not, but they were working at the drive-through window at Taco Bell. And I remember, probably says I used to go through there way more than I should have, but, but this person, she would talk to me and then she would be taking the next order and filling in order. She could do like 30 things at a time. She was amazing.
Yeah.
And never did that thing where ask you over the speaker and again in person if you want the sauce with that.
Yeah.
It's like she had it all together.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, wow. Can you imagine her working with, say, some of the groups and workshops with the ADHD kids that I work with or doing this, that I can imagine her just being like a conductor of an orchestra.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking there is a skill set. But it's not like somebody's walking up to her going, gosh, you've got a great set of skills. They're probably more like, thank God you're on the schedule tonight, because when you're here, you make up for 5 other people. But it's sort of like they're just so good, and yet maybe they're not being quite appreciated for their full skill set, but they're out there. It's just, we don't always know. I think there's so many people who are good at their jobs that could thrive and excel at a different job. And I think that while we've been saying that's true for ADHD for so long, like we're saying, okay, well, we can get out of the things like these detail-oriented jobs that we can struggle through but not thrive at. And then we put ourselves into these creative ventures, like a Wise Squirrels or some of the different things that I'm working on for ADHD outside the box resources, and go, we want to do all these things, but now we're sort of out there in space floating around and not sure where to anchor our next initiative. Instead, you have maybe people who are very organized and they might be thinking, I'm not sure what I'm contributing here. I'm doing the same thing each day. Or maybe I'd like to contribute more, but I don't necessarily know where to start. And I don't know, because again, these are going to be people who work better within a structured design. They'd like to have that structure and that's where we could benefit from that structure and that organization and that forward momentum.
Yeah.
And somebody to kind of clarify, to say, okay, guys, back on course. And something I'd found with faculty meetings back in the day is we'd always have someone in the small group who would be our person who'd like kind of listen and kind of direct. But then at some point, if we went too far off, he'd say, these are great ideas. Okay, let's get back and let's focus it to this end now. Let's explore that. And it's like you gently shape like a lump of clay until it goes exactly where you want it to go.
Yeah.
And I think maybe, I'm not sure how that would look yet, but I do feel like there are all of these different mindsets. And I think also that's where we need to go with it. Just like any other initiative, we talk about appreciating diversity of any other kind, and talk about, say, ethnicities, instead of it being this is better or worse, it's just different and complementary.
Well, and good things come, I have a presentation I do in the book that I'm working on. It's called The Root Down. And it's about knowing yourself and respecting and accepting yourself and loving yourself, and then connecting yourself, finding the others, as I said. And so with the root down though, like one of the points I make about it is I use a lot of metaphors around the forest and trees and things, and how, when a forest is diverse, it can last longer because it's diverse, because there's different species of trees. And it's the same thing that we need in our lives, being surrounded by different people. So that way they can inspire things. And to your point about food and things like that's, or different cultures. I mean, a great example of that is a restaurant in Toronto that I used to go to all the time. There's a little hole in the wall, and the couple that ran it was Jamaican and Indian. And they would take Indian food and stuff it into like Jamaican rotis. And it was like the best thing ever. Right. So it's the old chocolate and peanut butter thing. You just got to find where that peanut butter is to bump into them and then create something great.
Right. Well,
are you okay? You sounded like you were dying there. Are you okay?
Oh, I'm sorry. I had
you're good.
asthma. I have asthma, and I just took my inhaler and I'm fine now. But if I talk for too long, it's like get dry throat.
No worries.
I have a cold as well. So I think you're right. And I think if chocolate and peanut butter don't take so long to fight over which one's better, it really helps.
Yes.
So I think, can you imagine if, just to extend the analogy to make it silly, if peanut butter was trying to be chocolate or medicated till it chocolate or wear a chocolate suit or whatever. And it's just like, dude, you're not. You're peanut butter. Deal with it. But that's okay. And also, it's okay to be this chocolate bar. And if you put these elements together, it can be more than the sum of its parts, which is the whole point. Yeah. Just like separate chords and notes can create a synergy, and a bigger sound. You have these emergent qualities that come up. It's just maybe part of it is identifying it. And rather than getting too caught up in the end point where some people are just saying, okay, well, now that we know there's good things about ADHD, let's claim that it's awesome and stop there. And I don't think that's a good idea any more than saying that it's okay to have like my 1,000-pound life, but embrace it and not try to change it because it's not healthy.
Right. Yeah.
It's just not. Yeah. But you can certainly say that there's no need for the extreme stigmatization or no need to, characterize something as excessively negative. You can find that balance. And yet I think the conversation should not stop at just saying, either stopping it saying, well, there's good things. So now you guys go out and find them and we'll all be fine. It's not that simple. And it's also one of those things where I also don't want people to then go back to this kind of handling with kid gloves and sort of fixing these or sort of taking off, anything that sticks out, kind of trimming it so that it all can be uniform and look the same. Yeah. Because I think very much our value is in our differences. However, by virtue of the fact that they're differences, there's going to be some conflict and opposition, whether within ourselves or between each other. And so that's where I think the appreciation for it comes in, to realize this is an opportunity for us not to be afraid. I guess if you take away the stigmatization and people can say, all right, here I am. I have this type of brain. Sometimes it's obnoxious. Sometimes I'll interrupt you and cut you off. But I mean well, and I'm happy for you to tell me to shut up. Just tell me, and I will. I'll back off. I won't be offended. Yeah. And also, I could appreciate you putting me in a straight line. And if you need ideas, I'm happy to give them. That kind of thing where you can have that honest discussion and each person can kind of feel supported.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love this. Holly, this has been amazing. How can people get a hold of you and learn more about what you do?
Well, I will try to have my presence a little bit stronger but will be coming soon. I would say it's called ADHDOutsideTheBox.com.
Okay.
If you go there now, it will tell you that the site is in coming soon or something like that. But it is. I promise it is this time. Yeah. But I also, if anybody wants to shoot an email, I'm happy to follow up too in a ADHDOutsideTheBox@gmail.
Okay.
To continue the conversations. As far as this, I'm still kind of in the process of compiling a lot of these different resources and putting them out there. And similar to try just to develop this outward-facing tool that people can use to access different things and to, have different links to the publication. But I'm playing with it, and so I haven't made it live yet. Doesn't live out there yet. So I will be doing that. Maybe I could give you email some things to you too, in case you wanted to have a link when this goes live. Posted or so. But
yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I definitely want to support you and promote you and get folks to visit your website when it's up and sign up and all that good stuff.
Well, it'll have a link. It'll have a link to yours as well. I think and then also there's a couple of my colleagues that have done the same thing, and it's funny the way we reach out in strange ways to each other. There's not any other feedback or any other overlap other than maybe we stumble across each other's things or read this or read that and reach out. But we can also make this sort of connection, this network. And I like to do that through different things and not just a standard LinkedIn or something like that. So when I have mine, absolutely would want to encourage people to go and to visit and communicate on the Wise Squirrels. And I'm hoping maybe something can arise where there's, whether it be a virtual event to start with and maybe something more where people could just jump on and talk for a marathon, I imagine, if we all had ADHD, right?
No, this has been great. Holly, thank you so much. This has been fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Thanks for tuning in to Wise Squirrels. Please make sure you follow the show so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show, leave a review, please, and visit wisesquirrels.com/love for bonus content, audio comments that you can leave, membership information, free coaching, sponsorship details, booking information, and much more. Drop by wisesquirrels.com/love. Check out the link in the episode description below and explore now. Thanks again for listening. I've opened up something special. I'm offering a complimentary coaching session, and I invite you to wisesquirrels.com/coaching right now before it fills up.